I got some really cool news, and Robinson's been really helpful. This guy was alive back in World War II. He's one of the only eyewitnesses to having seen an actual U-boat.
For years, salvage divers have gone underwater in search of lost artifacts and pieces of history. So far, they have made numerous discoveries, but none is as fascinating as their most recent discovery.
Hey, Stevie, come up here. It's literally a freaking graveyard of the dock. Oh, wow.
It turns out that a group of salvage divers have discovered a hidden underwater Nazi vault. As if that's not enough, what they found in the vaults was incredibly shocking. What exactly are these vaults, and what do they contain that is so terrifying? Stay tuned, because what we're about to reveal is sure to blow your mind. Why the secret Nazi underwater superstructures were created. The first signs of the Nazi underwater superstructures being constructed appeared in 1939, the same year Hitler invaded Poland and forced Europe into flames. At that time, the Kriegsmarine, Germany's naval command, was already expanding its submarine fleet. Admiral Karl Dönitz, a career naval officer and one of the most calculating minds of the regime, had long championed the use of U-boats as Germany's answer to British naval dominance. His dream was not just to challenge Britain at sea, but to isolate it entirely and to strangle the island with a submerged blockade. To make that dream a reality, Dönitz needed more than vessels. He needed infrastructure, the type that couldn't be bombed into rubble, the type that could allow for construction, storage, and deployment far from enemy eyes. Unfortunately, he somehow managed to get this structure. Dönitz's dream gave rise to a campaign of underwater and coastal bunker construction that unfolded in secrecy throughout the early 1940s. Some of the earliest and most significant facilities were built in occupied France, particularly in cities like Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and Brest. There, the Nazis constructed immense submarine pens, reinforced concrete shelters designed to shield U-boats from Allied air raids. These structures were effectively fortresses, with roofs up to 275.5 inches thick, immune to conventional bombing. But while these bases were large and visible, they were not the most secret. As the war turned against Germany, particularly after 1943, the need for secrecy became worse. The Allies were gaining ground. The bombing of German cities had escalated. Industrial production was under threat. In response, a more radical approach was adopted, and that was the construction of hidden bases, some of them entirely submerged or built with access to the sea through flooded tunnels and camouflaged channels. One of the most whispered about examples was located along the Norwegian coastline, which had been occupied by Nazi Germany since 1940. Norway's jagged fjords, cold deep waters, and remoteness made it ideal for concealed maritime installations. Though many of these coastal facilities served logistical and defensive functions, there is fragmentary, deliberately obscured evidence that certain sites were used for more advanced, even experimental work. These were not merely dry docks or fuel depots. These were testing grounds for unconventional naval designs, including proposals for submersible aircraft launch systems and alternative propulsion technologies. Among the most persistent references in captured documents is a project labeled Project Basis Nord, which originally referred to an intended German naval base near the Russian border. But post-war Soviet and Western intelligence reports suggest that the name may also have been used as a blanket term for clandestine construction, possibly including bunkers with sealed underwater access points, where classified engineering projects were conducted under the protection of water and rock. Whether these sites were truly underwater in the modern sense, or merely heavily fortified and water accessible, is still debated, but the intent was clear, and that was to hide from the future. By 1944, the situation had become more desperate. With Allied forces landing in Normandy and the Eastern Front collapsing, the Nazi leadership knew defeat was inevitable. And yet, construction on hidden facilities continued, not to win the war, but to prepare for what came after. It was in this final phase that the most ambitious designs emerged: underwater vaults, pressure-resistant storage bunkers, laboratories accessible only by sea. One such project, referenced cryptically in decoded Allied intercepts and declassified German engineering logs, was codenamed Sea Tarn, which literally means sea camouflage. Its location was never confirmed, but several historians believe it may have referred to a series of storage and research caverns carved into coastal rock in the Baltic Sea near the island of Rügen. These would have housed components for advanced weapons, which were possibly parts of the V3 cannon, or prototypes for a new class of stealth submarine. The idea was to place irreplaceable material and scientific knowledge in places immune to Allied access, in the hope that it could be recovered after the war by loyal remnants of the regime, or even future allies. That belief in post-war resurrection, often dismissed as delusional, was surprisingly widespread among senior Nazis. Hitler's Alpine Redoubt myth may never have existed as a concrete plan, but the strategy of retreat and concealment was real. The underwater structures were built in this spirit, not as war-winning miracles, but as arcs of continuity, to preserve the possibility that Germany's most dangerous technologies might survive, even if the Reich fell. Things don't end there. One disturbing part of this story is in the intersection of science and ideology. As the war progressed, the line between military necessity and ideological fanaticism blurred. Himmler's SS, which had taken control of much of the Reich's scientific and archaeological apparatus, was obsessed with origins like myths of ancient Aryan civilizations, lost knowledge, and secret powers supposedly buried beneath the earth or sea. Though these beliefs were pseudo-historical, they were institutionalized, and it's possible that some of the underwater facilities were used to store artifacts or conduct studies that combine technical research with ideological superstition. This convergence between myth and military need was not only tolerated but funded, and it led to bizarre undertakings that are difficult to classify even today. Some captured reports after the war mentioned sealed rooms lined with lead, strange devices submerged in saltwater tanks, or attempts at environmental testing for materials of unknown origin. Whether these were desperate attempts to advance military science or reflections of occult obsession remains uncertain. What is clear is that after 1945, many of these sites vanished. Some were flooded deliberately. Others were blown up by retreating German forces. A few were quietly absorbed by the Soviets or the Western Allies, their contents classified and forgotten. Satellite imagery and sonar scans taken in later decades have hinted at massive artificial formations under certain parts of the Baltic and Norwegian coasts with straight edges, geometric hollows, and reinforced entrances sealed under decades of silt and cold. To this day, only fragments remain like partial blueprints, contradictory eyewitness accounts, rusted concrete entrances half swallowed by tides. No comprehensive archive of these underwater structures has ever been uncovered. The records that do exist are heavily redacted or lost. The rest is embedded in the bedrock beneath the ice-dark sea, where purpose-built structures wait in silence, untouched. Since the war, they were never meant to save. These underwater superstructures were certainly dangerous, but were they the only oppressive structures the Nazis created? Keep watching, because what we're about to reveal will shock you. Other dangerous structures the Nazis built. It is often said that the most terrifying architecture is not merely what towers above, but what hides below, what remains after the fires are out and the flags are torn down. Nazi Germany, in its fervent pursuit of power and permanence, did not merely construct these underwater superstructures, it carved out dominion through engineering. The most infamous of these, of course, are the concentration and extermination camps, not only sites of unspeakable horror, but coldly efficient industrial systems of death. Auschwitz-Birkenau, operational from 1940, was far more than a camp. It was a mechanized slaughterhouse disguised by barracks and chimneys. But while these places rightly dominate the conversation, they were not the only hazardous constructions the regime created. There were others, less visible, but no less lethal in their purpose. Begin, for instance, with Peenemünde, located on the Baltic coast. In 1936, when Hitler's generals were still dreaming of blitzkrieg and bloodless victory, the Nazi High Command gave the green light to build what would become the Heeresversuchsanstalt Peenemünde, which was the Army Research Center. Its mission was simple but chilling: to invent the future of war. By 1942, it had succeeded. Here, under the direction of Wernher von Braun and other scientists who would later shape the American space program, the V-2 rocket was born. It was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. Over 3,000 V-2s were launched, many of them targeting London, Antwerp, and Liège, delivering death at supersonic speed. But the rockets were only part of the danger. The site itself was vast, ringed with bunkers, labs, power stations, and airstrips. Beneath it were hidden rail lines and gas pipelines. When the Allies bombed it in August 1943, the blast killed over 700 forced laborers, many of whom had been building the facility against their will. Even in its destruction, Peenemünde was soaked in blood. As the Allies closed in during 1944, the Nazi regime, which was desperate to continue weapons production, moved the V-2 program underground. They turned to one of their most sinister creations, Mittelwerk, a subterranean weapons factory carved into the Kohnstein mountain near Nordhausen. The tunnels stretched for miles, lit dimly by gas lamps and crawling with disease and dust. More than 60,000 prisoners, mostly from the nearby Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, were forced to work in these hellish caverns. Over 20,000 of them died, some from starvation and abuse, others executed for the smallest infractions. The rockets built here killed thousands across Europe, but the factory itself killed even more. Mittelwerk was dangerous not only for what it produced, but because of what it revealed: a pattern of building underground fortresses, secret by necessity, cruel by design. The Nazis had long embraced the underground as a way to shield their operations from Allied bombers. But by 1944, they had made a science of it. In Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Austria, entire mountains were hollowed out for hidden weapons production. One of the largest of these projects was Project Ries, meaning Project Giant, located in the Owl Mountains of Lower Silesia. Begun in 1943, Ries was meant to be an enormous underground command complex for Hitler and the SS leadership, a place to continue the war, even if Berlin fell. The labor came from the nearby Gross-Rosen concentration camp, and the conditions were, predictably, inhumane. Workers were beaten, starved, and crushed under falling rock. Tunnels were dug beneath the Xiaz castle, and massive halls were blasted out of granite beneath the mountains. But the project was never completed. When Soviet forces approached in 1945, the SS flooded sections of the tunnels and destroyed blueprints. To this day, many chambers remain sealed, unexplored. Some historians believe treasure, documents, or even experimental weapons remain buried within. Speaking of weapons, the V-3 supergun was another deadly structure, though few remember it now. It was not mobile like the V-2, nor aerial like the Luftwaffe's bombers. It was fixed in place, hidden beneath a massive bunker in Mimoyekes, France, aimed at London and intended to rain down hundreds of shells per hour. Its barrels were more than 130 meters long, buried in the chalk hillside, angled perfectly for cross-channel bombardment. Construction began in 1943, but before it could become operational, the Allies discovered it. In July 1944, it was bombed repeatedly, finally destroyed by tallboy earthquake bombs dropped by the RAF. If it had been completed, the V-3 could have changed the nature of warfare entirely. No planes, no troops, just silent death from an unbombable gun. Even more sinister were the chemical weapons facilities. Though Hitler famously avoided using gas on battlefields, perhaps haunted by his own mustard gas injury in World War I, he did not shy away from producing it. The Nazis stockpiled vast quantities of taboon and sarin nerve agents, produced at a complex near Die Herrenfurth, which is now Brzeg Dolny, Poland. From 1942 onward, the Anorgana Chemical Works churned out these deadly substances under extreme secrecy. The structures themselves were dangerous, leaking toxins, filled with pressurized chambers and volatile mixtures. Had the war turned in Germany's favor, these agents were ready for use, likely against the Eastern Front. In the north, another type of dangerous structure was developed. It was the radar and communications towers, including the enormous Wassermann and Mammoth radar systems, capable of detecting aircraft hundreds of kilometers away. These were among the largest radar structures of the war, and they gave Germany an early warning system far ahead of its time. The technology itself was impressive, but the risk they posed was greater than tracking Allied planes. These sites were also designed to support radio-guided weapons, including the Fritz X glide bomb, which was a remote-controlled bomb used to sink Allied ships. The facilities that housed this technology, like those near La Palisse and Rechlin, were sprawling, reinforced, and heavily guarded. And finally, there were the bunkers. These bunkers were not just the Führer bunker in Berlin, but a whole network of hardened command posts, weapons storage facilities, and military headquarters buried across Germany and its territories. The Wewelsburg Castle, seized by Heinrich Himmler in 1934, was meant to be the ideological core of the SS, surrounded by underground tunnels and ceremonial chambers. Himmler envisioned it as a spiritual command center for the Aryan elite, which was a fantasy wrapped in concrete and cruelty. By 1945, many of these structures had become tombs. Some were destroyed to prevent capture. Others were sealed, their entrances lost to time or swallowed by forests, but they were real, massive, brutal, and built with one purpose in mind: to ensure the Nazi vision could survive, endure, and, if necessary, be reborn from beneath the rubble. That is what makes them dangerous still. Not just the bombs they housed, or the gases they distilled, or the men they sheltered, but the idea that a regime could embed itself in rock and steel so deeply that it could not be simply defeated. It would have to be excavated, unraveled, piece by piece, layer by layer. As expected, these structures had terrible effects on their victims. Stick around to find out what these effects were. The after effects of these torture structures on their victims. The war ended in 1945, but for many survivors, it never truly ceased. Long after the camps were emptied and the barbed wire rusted under rain, those who had endured the worst of the Nazi regime carried the war inside their bones. The damage didn't unspool with peace treaties. It stayed, heavy and wordless, lodged behind their eyes and beneath their skin. Pain outlived its source. It was stitched into their muscles, into their thoughts, into the choices they made in kitchens, in bedrooms, in silence. For some, the physical consequences were immediate and permanent. Starvation had withered their frames to hollow shells, and even after liberation, many could no longer digest food properly. Stomachs shrunken by hunger, intestines ravaged by disease, teeth long gone or loosened, bones brittle from calcium loss. These were not things that could be undone with bread and butter. Many survivors, even decades later, remained thin, not by choice, but by damage. Some had lungs scorched by gas exposure, others limped from poorly healed fractures, and still more carried burns, scars, and missing limbs from punishments and experiments no human should have had to endure. Women rendered infertile, men who never regained strength. The body remembers long after the mind tries to forget. And then there was the night. For thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, night became an enemy. Sleep refused to come easily. When it did, it arrived twisted, laced with visions of things once seen, shouting, boots, narrow rooms, the throb of cold. Survivors described recurring dreams for years, of being chased, of being numbered, of running out of breath while voices screamed in a language they no longer wished to understand. They woke up soaked in sweat, pulse hammering in their throats. In their waking lives, the survivors lived quietly. Some clung to order, building lives of rigid structure because chaos was a thing they had known too well. Others drifted, unable to trust the permanence of anything. Many married quickly, desperately, as if love could serve as proof they still belonged in the world. But intimacy was often difficult. Bodies that had been hurt were wary of touch. Minds that had survived horror mistrusted joy. Some survivors pulled away from their children emotionally, not because they didn't care, but because they feared the return of loss. They had once watched everyone they loved vanish. The fear that it could happen again never truly left. Some bore their pain with silence, others with testimony. Survivors fell loosely into two kinds of responses: those who tried to bury the past and those who could not. In homes around Europe, in Israel, in America, in Canada, children grew up knowing something unspoken lurked in the room. They heard their parents cry when no one was watching. They found faded photographs tucked into books, locked drawers with yellowed documents, the occasional glimpse of a number tattooed on a wrist quickly hidden beneath a sleeve. The trauma passed down, quietly but insistently, through stories told and not told. It was not only the victims who suffered, it was also their children, raised among shadows. That's not all. Mental illness was common, but often unnamed. Depression lingered like smoke. Anxiety hovered beneath the surface. In the post-war years, terms like PTSD did not exist. Victims were told to be grateful, to start again. Many did. But starting again with a fractured soul is a different thing entirely. Some drank to sleep. Some hoarded food they never touched. Others kept emergency bags packed by the door, convinced they might have to flee again, because they had once seen safety disappear overnight. They trusted few people. Some trusted no one at all. And yet, among the wreckage, life continued. Some survivors became teachers, doctors, poets. They built communities. They told their stories when the world was finally willing to listen. Others never spoke a word about what had happened to them. But silence, too, is a kind of voice. It tells its own version of what was lost. So what do you think about the underwater superstructures and the other torture devices the Nazis used? Let us know in the comment section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the following video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.